Hello, welcome back to the last part of the lecture on Chapter 1 of Capital Volume 1. Chapter 1 being the commodity, as you might remember, hopefully. Marx begins Capital with a chapter on the commodity because that is for him the most basic category with which to describe modern society, or as he puts it, the type of society where the capitalist mode of production prevails. That's what we are on about, and we are now looking at the fourth section, so the last section of chapter 1. That is the famous one, which is called the fetishism of the commodity. It's a very strange chapter in a sense. So it begins with some of the most famous and the most extraordinary rhetoric, if you like, so the most sort of in sort of literary terms, if you look at it as a piece of writing probably the most extraordinary piece, and for that reason the most famous of, along with some others like the 18th Brumaire and the Manifesto, obviously, but the chapter on the fetishism of the commodity is probably the most famous and also the most influential in modern social theory of from all of Marx's writings. The fourth section begins with this. It begins almost like a recap. So but that is true of pretty much all the sections so far. Marx always begins with a bit of a recap what he has developed so far, and then he develops it a bit further. So that's basically the way of presentation that is predominant here, which is quite helpful because it always gives you a reprise, so you can kind of you do find things that are sort of familiar. Yes, we've had that before, and then there's a shift in emphasis, or a slight shift in the angle in which Marx presents these things. So that's happening on the first few pages. That's the really heavy stuff. So it begins with this very strange comments that are full of sort of philosophical and theological allusions, and then the fourth section, then there is a short methodological reflection, and then the whole thing sort of peters out in a strange way. So there's a sort of an anticlimax. So it begins very excitingly, and then it sort of gradually just dies away as if you look at it as a piece of writing. That's how I feel about it anyway. So we will mostly look at the first few pages and then look at some passages from the rest of section 4, and then the second and the third chapters are basically still around the same themes about the commodity and money in particular. So the chapter 3 contains a lot of stuff, some of that somewhat more technical, about the concept of money and how money develops out of the relative value form and all that. So basically picking up things mostly from the third section of the first chapter and developing them in much more detail, which we will not look at. So after the first chapter, we will jump to chapter 4 for the very good reason that this is where the concept of capital is introduced. So the question, in case you were wondering what is actually the capitalist mode of production, that question is basically or is given a first principal answer in chapter 4. That is therefore absolutely key to look at. So chapters 2 and 3 are sort of optional in a sense, I would say. But obviously, if your primary interest was in money, then obviously chapter 3 would be your favorite chapter probably. So let's find the text. Here's the text. Section 4, the fetishism of commodities and the secret thereof. So it begins with this assertion of Marx that there is something mysterious going on with the commodity form. So this section begins with emphasizing all the things that are not mysterious. So he says here, it's clear as noonday that man, by his industry, man again meaning human being, changes the forms of materials furnished by nature in such a way as to make them useful to him or her. So that is the obvious thing, and that is the thing, or that is one of the things that are true of any type of society. So Marx very meticulously always emphasizes which of his claims are meant to be valid for any kind of human society, for the entire human civilization, if you like, which is basically the history of how humans change things found in nature and make them useful, as he's putting it here. And he distinguishes them very explicitly from the things that are specific to the capitalist mode of production, that are historically and societally specific. So he always emphasizes that distinction. So here, simply taking stuff from nature and transforming them, that's just normal. That's happening throughout history. That's not special. But then, in modern society, what happens is that a table, which is a useful thing, continues to be that common everyday thing, a piece of wood transformed into something that's useful, but as soon as it steps forth as a commodity, so takes the form of appearance of the commodity in a commodity-producing society, and obviously modern capitalist society is a society where the commodity form is the prevailing form in which wealth appears. Whereas, as I mentioned before, there have been other types of society where commodities existed, but they existed only in the margins of society. So in our society, it takes center stage. And this is where this humble thing, table, piece of wood, basically, is changed into something transcendent. So this is the beginning of Marx employing basically theological, or if you like, metaphysical, philosophical language to describe the basic category of political economy, the commodity. It evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas. So the table itself seems to have ideas of its own concerning how to act. That's the mystery. So that the things, the commodities, seem to have a life of their own. And basically what he's trying to say there, or what he's sort of conveying in this very strange semi-theological language, is basically a reflection on our everyday experience, or certainly mine, and I assume probably also yours, that we live in a social world over which we have no control. So that we are surrounded by things, or thing-like relationships and institutions that seem to have their own ideas. So if you think of an institution as a social thing, then, like the table here, this thing, this institution, in its wooden brain, you probably can think of one or two instances where that description would apply, develop grotesque ideas and make us do things over which we have no control. So I think that is the basic experience that Marx is reflecting here with this sort of theological language. So this mystical character does not originate in the use value of the commodities, reflecting useful kinds of labor, etc. Again, the formulation here, expenditure of brain, nerves, muscles, etc., etc. So we had all this before. This is kind of recap in a sense. Secondly, with regard to that which forms the groundwork for the quantitative determination of value, so as opposed to simply the value form, so the quantity of value that is represented by a commodity, we're talking about labor time, so labor measured in time, that it costs to produce the means of subsistence, etc., etc. That must necessarily be an object of interest to mankind. So people have always, in any form of society, again that is a generic sort of claim, in any form of society people must have been thinking about how can I use my time best, so either to produce more wealth, or to have more time to lounge around and not work or do enjoyable things of other sort, or whatever. So the question of labor time as such does not necessarily have anything to do with capitalism. That is just also a normal part of probably any type of human society. And then the last point here, in the list of things that are not mysterious, he says from the moment that men in any way work for one another, men human beings, their labor assumes a social form. So in all societies, labor is social in some form. But in some societies that would be a directly social form where people probably coordinate in some form, whereas in capitalist society that is an indirectly or a mediatedly social form, which is much more complex, and that is where the mystery basically comes from, because the mediation between individuals in society, basically to coordinate and sort of adapt to each other the things we do, the labor or work, it is not explicit, and it is not obvious, it is not consciously done, it somehow happens behind our backs. And that's basically at the core of Marx's argument here. If you strip off the exciting language, the mystery comes from the opaqueness of the way a society is organized, the kind of mediated character of the organization of society. So, question, whence then, wherefrom, arises the enigmatical character of the product of labor so soon as it assumes the form of commodities? So that is the key question here. Clearly from this form itself. Again, the emphasis is on the word form. So it is the form that the commodity form that wealth takes in capitalist society. That's where the enigma, the mystery, the opaqueness comes from. And now this is worth reading a bit more of the following sequence. The equality of all sorts of human labor is expressed objectively by their products all being equally values. The measure of the expenditure of labor power by the duration of that expenditure takes the form of the quantity of value of the products of labor. And finally, the mutual relations of the producers, within which the social character of their labor affirms itself, take the form of a social relation between the products. So these three bullet points, although there weren't bullet points in the day obviously, but these are the three these three points here that are like the kind of the condensed version of the entire argument. So the mysteriousness, the strangeness of this social form results from these three aspects. The equality, the equality of human labor, the equality of the commodities insofar as they are all values and therefore different quantities of something that is essentially of the same substance, this substance being dead labor. Then the quantification of that coming from the measuring of the time, measuring of labor in the category of time, and then the third point here is that, and that is perhaps the most important, that so I have to jump between these pages here, the mutual relations of the producers. So that is sort of the reality of any society, that producers mutually relate to each other in order to coordinate activities within society addressed by work or labor, within which the social character of the labor affirms itself. So labor in society is always social, because you cannot have non-social labor. That would be just that would perhaps be a hobby, or that would be not even a hobby, is not social. So in a society any form of labor has to be societal by definition, but how that socialization actually takes place, that is the question. And here the mysterious thing, or the core issue here, is that this sociality takes the form of a social relation between the products. And now that that is really the very mysterious formulation. So obviously you would need to ask yourself, what does that actually possibly mean? How can the products have a social relation between themselves? And of course that is somewhat sarcastic as a formulation, because the things can't really have social relations. Social relations by definition would be social relations between people in society, right? That's what you would expect, but the mystery is that in capitalist society it at least very strongly seems to be the case that we do not have social relations between the human beings, but we have social relations between the things, because it is the things and the relations between the things, in particular the relations in which they exchange themselves against each other, apparently without necessarily even our involvement. So they seem to be doing this themselves on the basis of these grotesque ideas that their wooden brains have produced. These things themselves seem to exchange themselves, and from their relationships, the relationships between these products, basically results the sociality that determines how we live. Our lives are determined by the grotesque ideas coming from the wooden brains of these things. So that is sort of the basic idea here. A commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it the social character of man's labor, so man's labor, human individuals' labor in society is social, appears to them, to us, as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor. Because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation existing not between themselves but between the products of their labor. That's the big idea. You see that Marx uses the vocabulary of appearance. So things appear to be a certain way. They are presented to them, and so on, which sort of implies that this appearance is not necessarily true, but because the appearance is so strong and our behavior is actually based on that appearance, that this appearance becomes a sort of truth, because this is what actually structures our behavior, our acting in society. So it is an appearance, yes, but that does not mean that it is sort of what you sometimes find in certain versions of Marxism, sort of a false consciousness or something. So Marx emphasizes at several places later on in the text that this is not at all false. It is actually true, because that's how it works. So the reality of society works on the basis of these appearances, and therefore these appearances are real. So they are actually the basis of how we act in society, although they are to some extent illusional, but they are sort of real illusions. They are true illusions in a certain sense, you might want to say. So now he uses again an illustration, and here's something rather strange happening. He uses here an example from physics, from optics, basically, to illustrate the point he's trying to making, but then he says in the next sentence that this is actually not a very good example to illustrate. So he says, in the same way, the light from an object is perceived by us not as the subjective excitation of the optic nerve, but as the objective form of something outside the eye itself. So what he's trying to say here is, and this is a kind of philosophically speaking, a very much sort of a Kantian kind of argument, that the way the eye works is actually an activity of our own eye and brain, because our brain produces an image based on an excitation of the nerve. So again, as in the formulation that we had several times, it's brain, nerves, muscles that do things. So we actually, as humans, produce an image of an object. So there is somewhere out there are objects, and they send light into or onto our eyes, and we produce then an image. But we think that this image is actually an image produced by the thing out there, which is wrong. Strictly speaking, that's not the case, because we produce the image, not the thing. The things don't produce images. The things just reflect light. And from those light reflections, we produce images. Okay, so this is sort of an illustration of the of this point that the what actually are relations between us appear in the image that we have of society as relations between the things. But then he says, but, and so he's basically now kind of arguing against his own illustration here, but in the act of seeing, there is at all events an actual passage of light from one thing to another, and light is sort of an actual, as it were, material thing. There's actually light being reflected from the thing onto the optical nerve, from the external object to the eye. There is a physical relation between physical things, but it is different with commodities. So the comparison works up to a certain point, but then it doesn't work, because here we are talking obviously of a societal event, whereas optics talks about an actual physical event. So there, the existence of the things qua commodities and the value relation between the products of labor, which stamps them as commodities, have absolutely no connection with their physical properties. So that's different from light reflecting from things, and with the material relations arising therefrom. There, it is a definite social relation between men. So there, in the case of commodity producing society, commodity relations, it is a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. So this sounds very much, so he emphasizes kind of modern sociology would probably refer to this as a social construction, or I would probably prefer the word a social constitution of that image, that appearance that we have. What he calls here the fantastic form. So this form of relation is fantastic. Probably a better word for fantastic would be imaginary. I think that would be the more correct translation of the word here. It is a relation that happens in the realm of the imaginary, the social imaginary, if you like. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, so a better comparison, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. So he's moving. So he's basically trying out the illustration from physics. Says, yeah, that only works to a certain point, but here I have a much better illustration, and that comes from religion. And that's a classic issue from Enlightenment philosophy. In that world, the religious world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. This I call the fetishism, which attaches itself to the products of labor so soon as they are produced as commodities, and which is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. So that is probably the most famous sentence here in this, at least in the first chapter. And this fetishism of commodities has its origin in the peculiar social character of the labor that produces them. Not in the social character as such, in the peculiar social character, namely a social character of labor that is opaque, that is not transparent, that is not based on conscious sort of a deliberate social mediation, but a kind of indirect, almost automatic, outwardly imposed mediation of different labors in society. So that's the main point here. The reason that he uses the word fetishism, in my mind, is of a polemical nature, because if you think about what fetishism is, if you look at texts from the 19th century where philosophers and theologians and anthropologists discuss different types of religion. So fetishism for 19th century intellectuals is sort of the lowest form in the evolution of religion. So fetishism is, of course, what European colonial explorers from the 17th century onwards discovered in those faraway places that they visit and then colonize, and African societies in particular. They have fetishes, and the Europeans think of them obviously as very primitive. So fetishism is for 19th century Europeans the most primitive and backward form of religion that you can have. Obviously, anthropologists at the same time also point out that Christianity, which of course for these Europeans is the highest stage of a sort of almost a rational form of religion, contains quite a lot of fetishism itself. So we don't. I think you can, if you think about it, there are lots of fetishes in Christianity, in particular in Catholicism, but in all religions there are elements of fetishism. So fetishism is not, as a theological concept, such a strongly sort of fenced off area as these thinkers like Comte and Hegel, for example, would have assumed in the 19th century. So Marx uses this term, I think, basically to say that this particular social form that I discovered is the central social form of our type of society that is actually exactly like what you guys think is the most primitive form of religion. It's not just a religion, it is a really primitive form of it. And I think that is the sort of sarcastic or polemical aspect of Marx's choice of word here. So to talk to these late 19th century economists and other intellectuals thinking about basically modernity. What we have here is a theory of modernity, and Marx says, well, your modernity is actually very much like the form of society that you most despise, the society of fetish worship. So that's what capitalism basically is, a kind of a giant cargo cult, basically. But of course, it is a cargo cult that actually works, and that is the mysterious thing, or that is one other aspect of the mystery, and the reason that Marx is employing this sort of theological language here. And all this comes from the particular kind of social character of labor that is at the basis of capitalist society. And he explains that here. So since the producers do not come into social contact with each other until they exchange their products, because they are private producers, the specific social character of each producer's labor does not show itself except in the act of exchange. That means the labor of the individual asserts itself as a part of the labor of society only by means of the relations which the act of exchange establishes directly between the products, and indirectly through them, through the products between the producers. To the producers, therefore, the relations connecting the labor of one individual with that of the rest appear not as direct social relations between individuals at work, but as what they really are, material relations between persons and social relations between things. Now this is rather tricky stuff here, especially the last sentence here. The most remarkable thing is this, as what they really are. So I don't know, how can I underline this? So this is sort of contradicting our previous assumption, or the reading so far, that we are talking about something fantastically imaginary, perhaps illusionary. But here, this formulation, as what they really are, asserts that this illusion, or this imaginary sort of image we have of what it is we are doing, that's what it actually is. So it is that thing that is actually imaginary or illusory. That is sort of a deliberately paradoxical formulation here. As I tried to explain before, the point being is that society actually is based on these imaginary perceptions of what it is we actually do. And this imaginary perception is what is translated here as material relations. That is actually a wrong translation. So this word here, material, in German reads sachlich, which is much more like thingly or thing-like. So material here is definitely a wrong translation. So you should make a note and replace that by thing-like, or sort of if you like, reified, basically. Reified is the same thing. Thingly, so relations that take the form of things between persons. So reified persons, relations between persons, and social relations between things. So I have made some notes here. Oh yes, the word direct in the German text reads, what was it again? Unmittelbar. So basically immediate would be a better translation. Sachlich, I said that. And then, oh yes, here's some rather strange or difficult to translate things. In the next sentence,